10 shocking lies that created Christianity, the Bible's biggest lies. The foundations of the world's largest religion rest on stories so compelling, so deeply woven into our cultural fabric, that questioning them feels almost impossible. For nearly 2,000 years, billions of people have built their entire worldview around narratives that seem unshakable. Christmas celebrations, Easter traditions, the very calendar we live by, all anchored to events that supposedly happened in ancient Palestine. But what if I told you that the most sacred stories you've ever heard were carefully constructed lies? What if the birth narrative that fills churches every December, the genealogies that trace divine bloodlines, and the prophecies that seem to predict Jesus centuries before his arrival were all deliberate fabrications designed to create belief where none should exist? Today, we're going to examine 10 shocking lies that didn't just influence Christianity. They created it from the ground up. These aren't minor theological disagreements or differences of interpretation. These are fundamental deceptions that strike at the very heart of Christian doctrine, lies so audacious that once you see them clearly, you'll never look at religious history the same way again. And here's what makes this investigation so unsettling. Every single one of these lies can be proven using the same historical methods that scholars use to verify any ancient event. We're not relying on faith or belief systems here. We're following evidence, examining contradictions, and asking the kinds of questions that make institutions very uncomfortable. Before we dive in, let me be clear about something. This isn't an attack on people's personal faith or individual beliefs. This is about historical truth versus manufactured mythology. It's about understanding how powerful narratives get constructed, how they spread, and how they shape entire civilizations. Because once you understand these mechanisms, you'll recognize them everywhere, not just in ancient religions, but in modern politics, media, and social movements. The first lie we need to examine is perhaps the most beloved story in all of Christianity. The claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Every nativity scene, every Christmas pageant, every holiday card depicts Mary and Joseph traveling to this small town where the prophesied Messiah would enter the world. The story seems straightforward enough. According to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Joseph and Mary had to travel from their home in Nazareth to Bethlehem because the Roman Empire was conducting a census and everyone needed to return to their ancestral hometown to be counted. Mary was pregnant. They made the journey, found no room at the inn, and Jesus was born in a stable. It's a tale that has moved hearts for centuries. But here's the problem. This story is historically impossible. There is absolutely no evidence that the Roman Empire ever conducted a census requiring people to travel to their ancestral hometowns. In fact, such a requirement would have been completely contrary to how Roman administrative systems actually worked. Think about this logically for a moment. The Romans were incredibly efficient administrators. They had to be to control an empire stretching from Britain to the Middle East. Their taxation and census systems were designed to count people where they currently lived and worked, not where their ancestors might have lived 1,000 years earlier. Can you imagine the chaos that would result if everyone in the empire suddenly had to travel hundreds of miles to register in places they'd never seen, based on genealogies most people couldn't even verify? Roman census records that we actually possess show people being counted in their current locations. Tax collectors needed to know where people lived and what they owned right now, not where King David's lineage might theoretically trace back to. The entire premise makes no administrative, economic, or practical sense. So why would the gospel writers invent such an elaborate and implausible scenario? The answer lies in Jewish prophecy. The Hebrew scriptures contained a specific prediction in the book of Micah that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. This prophecy was well known among first-century Jews, and anyone claiming to be the Messiah would need to fulfill it. But there was a problem. Everyone seemed to agree that Jesus was from Nazareth. He was called Jesus of Nazareth. His followers were identified as Nazarenes, and even his enemies referred to his Galilean origins. Nazareth was a small, insignificant town, with no prophetic importance whatsoever. If Jesus was the Messiah, how could he be from Nazareth instead of Bethlehem? The Gospel writers solved this problem by creating a story that would get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem at exactly the right moment. They invented the census requirement, fabricated the ancestral hometown rule, and constructed a narrative that would place Jesus' birth in the prophetically correct location. And here's where it gets even more suspicious. Matthew and Luke, the only two Gospels that mention the Bethlehem birth, tell completely different and contradictory stories about how it happened. Matthew focuses on wise men, Herod's massacre of infants, and a flight to Egypt. Luke tells us about shepherds, angels, and a presentation at the temple. These aren't just different perspectives on the same events. They're incompatible narratives that can't both be true. Even more telling, the earliest Gospel, Mark, never mentions Bethlehem at all. Neither does the Apostle Paul, who wrote extensively about Jesus just 20 years after the supposed crucifixion. Paul never once refers to Jesus being born in Bethlehem, never mentions a virgin birth, never discusses the fulfillment of messianic prophecies through the birth location. For Paul, Jesus' significance comes from his death and resurrection, not from where he was born. This silence is deafening. If the Bethlehem birth was such a crucial part of Jesus' identity, why do the earliest Christian writers completely ignore it? The answer is simple. The story hadn't been invented yet. It was added later by writers who needed to solve the theological problem of a Nazarene Messiah. The second major lie involves the genealogies that supposedly trace Jesus' lineage back to King David. Both Matthew and Luke provide detailed family trees. But here's the shocking truth. They're completely different and utterly contradictory. Matthew traces Jesus' ancestry through David's son Solomon, while Luke traces it through David's son Nathan. Not only do they disagree on this crucial branch, but they contradict each other on virtually every generation between David and Jesus. We're not talking about minor discrepancies here. These are entirely different family lines that somehow both supposedly lead to the same person. Some defenders of these texts claim that one genealogy is for Mary and the other for Joseph. But this explanation falls apart immediately when you read the actual texts. Both genealogies explicitly state they're tracing Joseph's line, not Mary's. But here's the deeper problem. If Jesus was born of a virgin, as Matthew and Luke also claim, then Joseph's genealogy would be completely irrelevant to Jesus' divine nature. Think about this carefully. If Jesus had no biological father, then he couldn't inherit anything from Joseph's lineage, including any claim to David's throne. Yet both gospel writers go to extraordinary lengths to prove that Joseph was descended from David, as if this somehow makes Jesus the rightful messianic heir. It's a theological contradiction so obvious that it should have unraveled the entire narrative. If Jesus is divine and born of a virgin, Joseph's ancestry is meaningless. If Joseph's ancestry matters for Jesus' legitimacy, then the virgin birth becomes impossible. This brings us to the third lie, and it's perhaps the most foundational deception of all, the virgin birth itself. Christians have been taught for centuries that the Hebrew prophet Isaiah predicted a virgin would give birth to the Messiah, and that Jesus fulfilled this ancient prophecy. But this claim is built on a translation error so basic, so fundamental, that it calls into question the reliability of every major Christian doctrine that followed. The Hebrew word used in Isaiah's original text is alma, which simply means young woman or maiden. It carries no implication of virginity. It's just describing a woman of childbearing age. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek centuries later, in a version called the Septuagint, the translators chose the Greek word parthenos, which can mean virgin, but doesn't necessarily mean virgin. This single translation choice, this one-word substitution, became the foundation for one of Christianity's most defining doctrines. Think about that for a moment. The virgin birth, a concept so central to Christian theology, that questioning it is considered heresy in most denominations is based entirely on a translator's interpretation of a Hebrew word that never implied virginity in the first place. The original Hebrew prophecy was likely referring to a young woman in Isaiah's own time, perhaps even Isaiah's own wife, who would bear a child as a sign to the king. It was a contemporary message with immediate political relevance, not a prediction about events hundreds of years in the future. But the Gospel writers, working with the Greek translation and needing to create divine origins for their central character, seized upon this mistranslation and built an entire mythology around it. They took a simple reference to a young woman and transformed it into a miraculous virgin birth that would define Christian belief for millennia. And here's the most revealing detail of all. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel written, never mentions a virgin birth. This supposedly crucial miracle, this defining moment of Christian theology, doesn't appear in the earliest account of Jesus' life. It only shows up in Matthew and Luke, which were written decades later when the mythology had time to develop and grow. These aren't innocent mistakes or harmless embellishments. These are calculated deceptions designed to make Jesus fit predetermined prophetic expectations. The birth location was fabricated to match Micah's prophecy. The genealogies were invented to establish Davidic lineage. The virgin birth was constructed from a mistranslated word to create divine origins. Each lie built upon the previous ones, creating a narrative so compelling that it convinced millions of people. But when you examine these stories with the same critical eye you'd use to evaluate any historical claim, the deceptions become impossible to ignore. The pattern is clear. When reality didn't match prophetic expectations, the gospel writers didn't question the prophecies. They rewrote reality. They created elaborate backstories, invented historical events, and constructed theological explanations that would make their central character fit the predetermined mold of Jewish messianic expectation. And this was just the beginning. These birth narratives were merely the foundation for even more audacious lies that would follow. Because if the origins were fabricated, what does that tell us about everything else? The fourth lie cuts even deeper than the fabricated birth stories, because it exposes something that should terrify anyone who values historical truth. We're talking about the complete absence of Jesus from contemporary historical records. Not a single historian, chronicler, or government official who lived during Jesus' supposed lifetime wrote a single word about him. This isn't just surprising, it's historically unprecedented for someone who allegedly had the kind of impact described in the Gospels. According to these texts, Jesus was drawing crowds of thousands, performing public miracles that defied the laws of nature, causing disturbances in major cities, and ultimately being executed as a political threat by Roman authorities. Yet somehow, this figure who supposedly shook the foundations of both Jewish and Roman society left behind no contemporary footprint whatsoever. Let's put this in perspective. We have detailed records from this exact time period about minor Jewish prophets, small-scale political uprisings, and even individual tax collectors who caused local disturbances. Roman historians were meticulous record keepers, especially when it came to potential threats to imperial stability. Jewish historians like Josephus documented every significant religious figure and political movement of the era. But Jesus, who allegedly fed 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread, raised the dead in full view of crowds, and caused such a commotion in Jerusalem that he had to be executed publicly. Complete historical silence. Not one contemporary Roman report, not one Jewish chronicle entry, not even a passing mention in administrative records. The first references to Jesus don't appear until decades after his supposed death, written by people who never met him and were recording stories they'd heard from others. By the time anyone bothered to write about Jesus, the events they were describing had already passed through multiple generations of oral transmission, theological development, and community storytelling. This historical vacuum becomes even more suspicious when you realize that the gospel writers themselves seem aware of this problem. They're constantly trying to anchor their stories to real historical events and figures, mentioning specific Roman governors, Jewish high priests, and political situations. But these connections often reveal more fabrication than authenticity. Take the census story we discussed earlier. The Gospel of Luke tries to ground the Bethlehem narrative in historical reality by mentioning Quirinius, who was indeed a Roman governor who conducted a census. But here's the problem. Quirinius's census took place in 6 CE, while Matthew places Jesus' birth during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BCE. That's a 10-year discrepancy that makes it impossible for both accounts to be true. These aren't minor chronological errors. They're the kind of mistakes you make when you're trying to retrofit fictional events into a real historical timeline without having lived through those events yourself. The fifth lie involves what might be the most famous claim in all of Christian apologetics. Paul's assertion that over 500 people witnessed the resurrected Jesus. This sounds incredibly compelling. After all, how could 500 people all be wrong about seeing the same thing? But here's what makes this claim so suspicious. Paul provides absolutely no details about this massive event. No names, no location, no specific date, no circumstances. Just a raw number thrown out without any supporting evidence. For someone making such an extraordinary claim, the complete absence of details is telling. Even more damaging to this story's credibility is the fact that none of the gospel writers, who supposedly had access to eyewitness accounts and were writing detailed narratives about Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, ever mention this gathering of 500 people. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all describe various resurrection appearances, but none of them reference this supposedly massive group witnessing event. How do you explain that? If 500 people really saw the resurrected Jesus, wouldn't that be the most important piece of evidence for the early church? Wouldn't every gospel writer want to emphasize this incredible confirmation of their central claim? The fact that they completely ignore Paul's 500 witnesses suggests either that the gospel writers didn't know about this event, didn't believe it, or knew it was fabricated. And here's the crucial detail that most people miss. Paul himself never claims to have been present at this supposed gathering. Everything he knows about it came from stories he heard from others. Paul's entire relationship with Jesus was based on visions and mystical experiences, not historical encounters. He's not reporting events he witnessed. He's passing along stories that may have grown in the telling. The pattern becomes clear when you step back and look at how these resurrection accounts developed over time. The earliest Christian writings contain the vaguest references to post-death appearances. But as the decades passed and more Gospels were written, the stories became increasingly detailed, dramatic, and specific. Mark, the earliest Gospel, originally ended with women finding an empty tomb and running away in fear, telling no one what they'd seen. That was it. No appearances, no conversations with the risen Jesus, no Great Commission. The resurrection appearance stories that now appear at the end of Mark were added later by scribes who felt the original ending was too abrupt. Matthew adds guards at the tomb and a dramatic earthquake. Luke includes a detailed walk to Emmaus and Jesus eating fish to prove he's not a ghost. John has multiple appearance scenes, including the famous Doubting Thomas episode where Jesus invites physical examination of his wounds. These aren't different perspectives on the same historical events. They're literary expansions of an increasingly elaborate mythology. Each gospel writer felt compelled to make the resurrection more concrete, more physical, more undeniable than the previous versions. But here's what's truly devastating to these resurrection claims. Not a single independent non-Christian source ever mentions an empty tomb, resurrection appearances, or any of the miraculous events that supposedly accompanied Jesus' death. No Roman records of earthquakes or darkness at noon. No Jewish accounts of temple curtains tearing or graves opening. No administrative reports about tomb guards or missing bodies. The silence is absolute and damning. If these events really happened as described, they would have been the most extraordinary occurrences in human history. Yet somehow, no one outside the Christian community noticed or bothered to record them. This brings us to the sixth lie, which strikes at the heart of Christian theology: the resurrection itself. The story of Jesus rising from the dead has become so familiar through repetition that most people never examine how this narrative actually developed in the earliest Christian writings. Paul, writing just 20 years after Jesus supposedly lived, never describes an empty tomb, never mentions guards or grave clothes or women discovering the burial site. His references to resurrection are vague and spiritual, more concerned with theological implications than physical details. Paul's Jesus doesn't walk around eating fish or inviting people to touch his wounds. Paul's Jesus appears in visions and spiritual encounters. The physical bodily resurrection with all its concrete details only appears in the Gospels written decades later. And even then, each Gospel tells a different story about how the resurrection was discovered and what happened afterward. Mark's women find an empty tomb and flee in terror, telling no one. Matthew adds an angel, an earthquake, and guards who are knocked unconscious. Luke has two men in dazzling clothes and includes detailed appearance stories. John transforms the story even further, adding personal conversations and physical interactions. These aren't eyewitness accounts of the same events. They're evolving legends that grew more elaborate with each telling. The resurrection story developed the same way all myths develop, through retelling, embellishment, and theological necessity. And here's the most crucial point: dying and rising gods were not unique to Christianity. Virtually every mystery religion in the ancient Mediterranean world had stories of deities who died and returned to life. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Mithras in Persia, Attis in Asia Minor. All of them had followers who believed their gods had conquered death and offered eternal life to believers. Christianity wasn't introducing a revolutionary new concept. It was adapting an existing mythological pattern that already resonated with ancient audiences. The difference is that Christianity eventually gained imperial backing, which allowed it to outlast and absorb its competitors. The resurrection wasn't a historical event that proved Jesus' divinity. It was a theological necessity that gave Christianity competitive advantage in the marketplace of ancient religions. Without resurrection, Jesus would have been just another failed Jewish preacher. With resurrection, he became the foundation of a world-conquering faith. But if the resurrection was manufactured to meet theological needs, rather than recorded because it actually happened, then what does that say about everything else Christians have been taught to believe? What does it mean when the most sacred event in Christian history turns out to be borrowed mythology dressed up as historical fact? The implications are staggering, because if the resurrection was fabricated, then the entire structure of Christian belief collapses. No resurrection means no conquered death, no eternal life, no divine validation of Jesus' teachings. It means Christianity's central promise is built on a lie so fundamental that questioning it threatens the very existence of the faith. And we're still only halfway through our examination of the lies that built Christianity. The deceptions we've uncovered so far, the impossible birth story, the contradictory genealogies, the mistranslated virgin prophecy, the absent historical record, the phantom 500 witnesses, and the borrowed resurrection mythology. These are just the foundation. The lies that follow are even more disturbing because they reveal how these fabricated stories were packaged, promoted, and eventually imposed on the world through a combination of literary deception and imperial force. The truth about how Christianity actually spread will shatter any remaining illusions about divine favor or grassroots conversion. The seventh lie exposes perhaps the most cherished assumption in all of Christian apologetics: that the Gospels were written by people who actually knew Jesus, or at least knew people who did. For generations, believers have been told that Matthew was a tax collector who followed Jesus, that Mark recorded Peter's memories, that Luke was a physician who interviewed eyewitnesses, and that John was the beloved disciple who leaned on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. This narrative creates a powerful sense of authenticity. If these books were written by actual companions of Jesus, then surely we can trust their accounts as reliable historical records. But here's the devastating truth. None of the Gospels were written by the people whose names they bear. The original manuscripts of these texts contain no author attributions whatsoever. They're completely anonymous documents. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added much later by church traditions that developed decades after the texts were already circulating. Biblical scholars across the theological spectrum, from conservative evangelicals to secular historians, agree on this fundamental point. We have no idea who actually wrote the Gospels, but the evidence gets even more damaging when you examine the timeline. The Gospels were composed between 70 and 100 CE, which places them 40 to 70 years after the events they claim to describe. That's not just one generation removed from the supposed eyewitnesses. That's 2 or 3 generations of storytelling, theological development, and community reshaping of memories. Think about what happens to stories over that kind of time span. Details change, events get reordered, theological interpretations become embedded in the narrative itself. By the time these anonymous authors were writing, they weren't recording fresh memories. They were crafting literary works based on decades of oral tradition that had already been filtered through multiple communities with different theological needs. And here's where the deception becomes truly audacious. The Gospel writers themselves seem to understand they're working with second-hand material. Luke openly admits in his introduction that he's compiling accounts from others who handed down stories about Jesus. He's not claiming to be an eyewitness. He's acknowledging that he's several steps removed from the original events. But if these books weren't written by eyewitnesses, why do they contain such specific details? Why do they quote exact conversations and describe precise locations? The answer reveals another layer of fabrication. These details weren't preserved by memory. They were created by literary imagination. Ancient biographical writing operated under completely different standards than modern historical documentation. Writers felt free to invent speeches, create dialogue, and construct scenes that illustrated the character and significance of their subjects. The Gospel writers weren't bound by modern concepts of factual accuracy. They were creating theological literature designed to convince readers of Jesus' significance. This explains why the Gospels contradict each other so frequently on basic factual matters. If they were truly based on eyewitness accounts, you'd expect consistency on fundamental details. Instead, you find constant disagreements about chronology, geography, genealogy, and even the words Jesus supposedly spoke. The eighth lie involves these very contradictions, particularly in the accounts of Jesus' final hours. If any part of the Jesus story should be historically reliable, it would be the crucifixion and death, the climactic events that supposedly had multiple witnesses and enormous significance for early believers. Yet, the passion narratives in the 4 Gospels disagree on virtually every major detail. The timeline shifts dramatically between accounts. John places the crucifixion on the day before Passover, while the other Gospels say it occurred on Passover itself. That's not a minor scheduling discrepancy. It's a fundamental disagreement about when the most important event in Christian history took place. The details of Jesus' final words change completely depending on which Gospel you read. In Matthew and Mark, his last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A cry of abandonment and despair. In Luke, he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." A peaceful surrender. In John, he simply says, "It is finished," a statement of completion and victory. Oh, These aren't different perspectives on the same utterance. They're completely different final statements that reflect different theological interpretations of Jesus' death. Matthew and Mark present a Jesus who feels abandoned by God. Luke presents a Jesus who maintains faith until the end. John presents a Jesus who remains in control of his destiny. The surrounding characters change as well. In Mark, both criminals crucified alongside Jesus mock him. In Luke, one criminal repents and is promised paradise. The women present at the cross are different in each account. The reaction of the Roman centurion varies. Even basic details like whether Jesus carried his own cross or had help differ between Gospels. These contradictions aren't the result of faulty memory or different perspectives on the same events. They're the product of different authors crafting different theological messages for different audiences. Each Gospel writer shaped the crucifixion story to emphasize particular aspects of their understanding of Jesus' significance. Matthew writes for a Jewish audience, so he emphasizes fulfilled prophecies and divine abandonment that echoes Jewish suffering. Luke writes for Gentiles, so he softens the harsh edges and emphasizes forgiveness and divine mercy. John writes last and presents the most developed theological interpretation, with a Jesus who remains divine even in death. The ninth lie reveals how these manufactured stories were eventually weaponized to control entire populations, the myth of early Christian martyrdom. You've probably heard countless stories about brave believers who chose death rather than deny their faith. Christians thrown to lions, burned as torches, crucified upside down, tortured in unimaginable ways, rather than abandon their beliefs about Jesus. These martyrdom stories serve a crucial psychological function. They suggest that the Christian message must be true because so many people were willing to die for it. After all, who would face horrible death for something they knew was a lie? But here's the problem. Most of these martyrdom accounts were written long after the supposed events, often by people who had no first-hand knowledge of what actually happened. The famous story of Peter being crucified upside down in Rome appears nowhere in contemporary records. It first shows up in apocryphal texts written more than a century later. The tale of Paul's beheading, the mass executions under Nero, the arena spectacles with Christians facing wild animals. These stories developed through generations of religious storytelling, not historical documentation. They became more dramatic and detailed with each retelling, eventually crystallizing into the heroic narratives that still inspire believers today. Even more revealing is what the earliest Christian writings actually say about persecution. Many early Christian texts show communities living peacefully alongside their pagan neighbors, participating in civic life, and facing occasional local conflicts rather than systematic imperial persecution. The organized, empire-wide persecution of Christians that features so prominently in later church history simply didn't exist during the supposed lifetime of the apostles. The Roman Empire was generally tolerant of religious diversity, as long as local communities maintained civic order and paid their taxes. So, why fabricate martyrdom stories? Because martyrdom is the ultimate validation technique. If you can convince people that your movement is built on the blood of heroes, that your truth is so precious it's worth dying for, then questioning that truth becomes not just intellectually difficult but morally reprehensible. Martyrdom stories transform doubt into betrayal and skepticism into sacrilege. They create an emotional barrier that prevents rational examination of the underlying claims. Who wants to be the person who questions the faith that saints died to preserve? The 10th and final lie exposes the most cynical deception of all: the claim that Christianity spread through divine favor and grassroots evangelism. The standard narrative presents early Christianity as a movement of the poor and oppressed that gradually won converts through the power of its message and the authenticity of its believers. This story is completely false. Christianity didn't conquer the Roman Empire through miraculous conversions or superior morality. It succeeded through political calculation, imperial endorsement, and systematic suppression of competing religions. The turning point came in the early 4th century, when Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity's potential as a unifying force for his fractured empire. Constantine wasn't experiencing a spiritual awakening. He was making a strategic decision. The old Roman gods were too numerous, too localized, too divisive to serve as effective imperial symbols. Christianity offered a single deity, a unified hierarchy, and an existing network of communities that could be harnessed for political purposes. Constantine's famous conversion at the Battle of Milvian Bridge wasn't a miraculous revelation. It was a calculated adoption of a symbol that could rally his troops and legitimize his rule. The cross became not a sign of humble sacrifice, but an emblem of imperial conquest. Once Christianity gained imperial backing, its expansion followed predictable patterns of political enforcement rather than spiritual persuasion. Pagan temples were closed or converted into churches. Traditional religious practices were banned. Alternative forms of Christianity were declared heretical and their adherents persecuted. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE wasn't a gathering of inspired believers seeking divine truth. It was a political assembly designed to create doctrinal uniformity that would serve imperial stability. Constantine summoned bishops from across the empire not to preserve authentic Christian teaching, but to end theological disputes that threatened political unity. From that moment forward, Christianity ceased to be a grassroots religious movement and became an instrument of state power. The Nicene Creed wasn't the product of spiritual revelation. It was the result of imperial decree designed to eliminate theological diversity that could challenge political authority. For the next 1,000 years, Christianity expanded not through voluntary conversion, but through conquest, coercion, and cultural destruction. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the forced baptism of indigenous peoples, the burning of libraries and temples, all of this flowed directly from Christianity's transformation into an imperial ideology. The Jesus who supposedly preached about loving enemies and turning the other cheek became the Christ of holy war and righteous violence. The religion that claimed to offer spiritual freedom became a system of intellectual and social control that would dominate Western civilization for centuries. Even the biblical canon itself was shaped by imperial politics rather than divine inspiration. The books that made it into the New Testament were chosen by councils of men whose primary concern was creating doctrinal unity, not preserving historical truth. Alternative gospels that presented different views of Jesus were systematically destroyed, ensuring that only the approved version of Christianity would survive. This wasn't a religion rising on the strength of its truth claims. It was an ideology rising on the strength of imperial enforcement. Christianity became successful not because it was true, but because it was useful to people who wielded political power. And here's the most chilling realization. This pattern continues today. Modern Christianity still operates as a tool of social control, still demands unquestioning obedience to authority, still punishes intellectual curiosity that threatens established doctrine. The methods have become more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. When you strip away the mythology, the miracle claims, and the emotional manipulation, what you're left with is a story of how a small, apocalyptic sect was transformed into a world-spanning system of control through deliberate deception, political opportunism, and systematic suppression of alternatives. These 10 lies didn't just influence Christianity, they created it. From the fabricated birth narratives to the imperial takeover, from the anonymous gospels to the manufactured martyrdom stories, every foundational element of Christian belief rests on demonstrable falsehoods. The implications are staggering. If Christianity's most basic historical claims are false, what does that say about the entire edifice of belief built upon them? What does it mean for the billions of people who have structured their lives around these stories? What does it reveal about the nature of religious authority and the mechanisms of social control? These aren't just academic questions about ancient history. They're urgent contemporary issues about truth, power, and human freedom. Because the same techniques used to construct Christianity are still being used today to manufacture consent, suppress dissent, and control populations through carefully crafted narratives. The story of Christianity's fabricated foundations is really the story of how myths become reality, how repetition creates belief, and how institutional power can transform lies into sacred truth. Once you understand these mechanisms, you'll recognize them everywhere, not just in ancient religions, but in modern politics, media, and social movements. The question isn't whether these revelations will disturb your worldview. The question is what you'll do with that disturbance. Will you retreat into comfortable denial, or will you follow the evidence wherever it leads? Will you defend the familiar lies, or will you pursue the uncomfortable truth? Because once you see how thoroughly Christianity's foundations have been fabricated, you can't unsee it. Once you understand how these narratives were constructed and why they were promoted, the entire structure of religious authority begins to crumble. And that collapse creates space for something far more valuable than manufactured faith. Genuine understanding based on evidence, reason, and intellectual honesty. The lies that built Christianity have controlled human consciousness for nearly 2,000 years. But lies, no matter how ancient or widely believed, cannot withstand sustained examination by minds committed to truth. The spell is breaking, and what emerges from its collapse might finally allow humanity to move beyond the need for comforting deceptions toward a more honest relationship with reality itself. The weight of these revelations extends far beyond academic curiosity or theological debate. What we've uncovered represents nothing less than the systematic deconstruction of history's most influential narrative. But understanding how these lies were constructed is only half the equation. The more disturbing question is why they worked so effectively, and why they continue to work today. The psychological mechanisms that made these fabrications successful reveal something profound about human nature and our relationship with authority, truth, and meaning. When people desperately want to believe something, when they need it to be true for their sense of purpose and identity, they become remarkably willing to overlook contradictions, ignore evidence, and accept explanations that would be laughable in any other context. Consider the mental gymnastics required to maintain belief in the Christmas story. Once you know the historical facts, you have to accept that a Roman Empire known for meticulous record-keeping somehow conducted a census so unprecedented and illogical that no trace of it exists in any administrative document. You have to believe that two gospel writers, supposedly inspired by the same divine source, could tell completely incompatible stories about the same miraculous birth. You have to ignore the fact that the earliest Christian writers never mentioned this supposedly crucial event. But millions of people continue to celebrate Christmas, sing carols about the journey to Bethlehem, and set up nativity scenes depicting events that never happened. The emotional investment in these stories has become so deep, so fundamental to cultural identity, that questioning them feels like an attack on everything sacred. This is how effective lies work. They don't just provide information, they create identity. They don't just tell you what happened, they tell you who you are, what you belong to, what gives your life meaning. Once a lie becomes central to someone's sense of self, defending it becomes a matter of psychological survival. The virgin birth myth operates the same way. Even when confronted with the linguistic evidence that Isaiah never predicted a virgin birth, even when shown that the earliest gospel doesn't mention it, believers find ways to rationalize the contradictions. They'll argue that God chose to fulfill a prophecy that was never actually made, or that divine inspiration somehow transcends translation errors, or that faith requires believing things that seem impossible. These aren't intellectual arguments. They're emotional defenses against information that threatens to unravel an entire world view. The virgin birth isn't just a historical claim about an ancient birth. It's a cornerstone of divine uniqueness that separates Jesus from every other religious figure. Remove that uniqueness, and Jesus becomes just another Jewish preacher whose followers got carried away with their grief and hope. The genealogy contradictions reveal another layer of the psychological manipulation. By providing detailed family trees, the Gospel writers created an illusion of historical precision. Long lists of names feel factual, authoritative, researched. Most readers never bother to compare the two genealogies side by side because the mere presence of genealogical information suggests careful documentation. This is a classic technique of persuasive deception. Overwhelm the audience with impressive-sounding details that discourage close examination. The more complex and specific the false information appears, the less likely people are to investigate it thoroughly. Who wants to spend hours cross-referencing ancient genealogies when the very existence of such detailed records seems to confirm the story's authenticity? The historical silence surrounding Jesus reveals perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this deception. The transformation of absence into presence through theological sleight of hand. Instead of acknowledging that no contemporary sources mention Jesus, Christian apologists have created elaborate explanations for why such sources wouldn't exist or wouldn't have survived. They argue that Jesus was too insignificant during his lifetime to attract historical attention, which directly contradicts the gospel accounts of massive crowds and public controversies. They claim that hostile sources would have been destroyed by later Christians, ignoring the fact that many hostile sources critical of Christianity did survive. They suggest that the absence of evidence is itself evidence of a conspiracy to suppress the truth, turning the lack of historical support into a bizarre form of confirmation. This reversal of logical thinking, treating absence as presence, silence as testimony, lack of evidence as proof of cover-up, demonstrates how deeply the need to believe can distort rational thought processes. When people want something to be true badly enough, they'll accept explanations that would be rejected immediately in any other context. The phantom 500 witnesses story exploits another psychological vulnerability: the power of numbers to create credibility. 500 sounds impressive, overwhelming, impossible to dismiss. It suggests a level of verification that should silence all skepticism. But Paul provides no names, no details, no way to verify his claim. He might as well have said 5,000 or 50,000. The number means nothing without supporting evidence. Yet this unsupported assertion has been repeated for centuries as one of Christianity's strongest proofs. It appears in sermons, apologetics books, and evangelistic presentations as though it were established historical fact. The repetition itself becomes a form of evidence. If the story is repeated often enough by enough authorities, it must be true. This reveals how institutional authority can transform unsubstantiated claims into accepted truth. When religious leaders, theologians, and respected figures within a community all repeat the same stories, questioning those stories begins to feel like questioning the entire community structure. Doubt becomes not just intellectual dissent, but social rebellion. The resurrection mythology demonstrates the most sophisticated level of this manipulation: the gradual transformation of spiritual metaphor into historical fact. Paul's earliest references to resurrection are vague, mystical, concerned with theological implications rather than physical details. But as the decades passed and more elaborate accounts were written, the metaphorical became literal, the spiritual became physical, the symbolic became historical. This process reveals how religious doctrines develop over time through a kind of theological inflation. Each generation of believers, wanting to make their faith more concrete and defensible, adds details, specificity, and miraculous elements that weren't present in earlier versions. The result is stories that sound increasingly impressive, but are actually moving further and further away from any historical foundation. The gospel contradictions about Jesus' final hours expose the human fingerprints all over these supposedly divine revelations. If these accounts were truly inspired by the same divine source, If they were really preserving accurate memories of the most important events in human history, they wouldn't disagree on basic facts like what day Jesus died or what his last words were. But when you understand that different authors were writing for different audiences with different theological needs, the contradictions make perfect sense. Each writer shaped the crucifixion story to emphasize the aspects of Jesus' death that would resonate most powerfully with their intended readers. They weren't preserving history, they were crafting propaganda. The martyrdom mythology reveals how historical narratives can be manufactured long after the supposed events to serve contemporary political needs. The elaborate stories of early Christian persecution weren't recorded by eyewitnesses or contemporary historians. They were created by later generations who needed heroic examples to inspire current believers and validate current authority structures. These martyr stories serve the same function as war propaganda. They transform religious affiliation into a kind of patriotic duty. If previous generations died for the faith, then questioning that faith becomes not just intellectual disagreement, but betrayal of sacred sacrifice. The supposed martyrs become moral hostages, preventing rational examination of the beliefs they allegedly died to preserve. The evidence is overwhelming, the pattern undeniable, and the implications earth-shattering. Christianity wasn't born from divine revelation. It was manufactured through deliberate deception, political opportunism, and systematic suppression of truth. These 10 lies didn't just influence the world's largest religion, they created it from nothing, transforming borrowed mythology into sacred doctrine through sheer repetition and institutional power. But here's what should concern you most. If they could fool billions of people for 2,000 years with lies this transparent, what else are you being deceived about right now? The same techniques that built Christianity are operating all around you. In politics, media, education, everywhere narratives are constructed to manufacture your consent and control your behavior. The spell is breaking, but only for those brave enough to look. If this investigation has shattered your assumptions about religious authority, subscribe now, because we've only scratched the surface. The next truth we uncover might be the one that finally sets you free.